Good evening, everybody. To judge by the posters advertising the event, I'm Professor Mark Gilbert. So just add a T to the end if you don't know me. Thanks very much for coming on a somewhat miserable evening. I'm sure we're going to have a really interesting and worthwhile discussion. Just to give a little bit of background on our speaker tonight, CICE Europe is very fortunate to have cooperative agreements, as we call them, with a number of very distinguished universities, Bologna being the oldest, but also McGill, SOAS, Sciences Po Lille, Diplomatic Academy of Vienna, and also Leiden University of the Netherlands, which is one of Europe's oldest and most distinguished universities. And our speaker tonight is, in fact, Lindsay Black, who is Associate Professor at Leiden University at their Institute for Area Studies. Lindsay is in Bologna as part of our new Visiting Scholar program, which will bring us academics from our partner schools to the campus to take part in events like this, to in particular to interact with students from the Maya degree, but not only, and who will be and we're hoping to increase the amount of academic cooperation between our mutual institutions and between our institutions. Lindsay will also be taking part in a discussion on Friday morning at 11 o'clock in room 101 on the study of the humanities and the importance of studying the humanities for international affairs. Now, Lindsay, like me, was extraordinarily well educated at Durham University, and then went on to do a PhD at the University of Sheffield. He's a specialist in Japanese culture, politics, and society, and has published extensively on Japanese foreign policy and in general on East Asian regionalism. When I was preparing this introduction, I had a look at his a list of publications in recent years, and he's been writing on Japanese conceptions of regional order in response to the South China Sea disputes, on conflict and cooperation in interregional relations in East Asia, on and so it goes on, talking about not only about Japan, but about Taiwan, about China, and as you can see from the title of the talk, also about Southeast Asia and Myanmar. Last year, earlier this year actually, he published a book entitled Disciplining Democracies, Human Insecurity in Japan-Myanmar Relations with Bristol University Press, if I'm not wrong. That's right. And anyway, that's the topic we're going to be talking about this evening. We'll be talking about the Rohingya and many other things. Professor Black will talk for 35 minutes and so, and then we'll go over Q&A. Lindsay, the floor's yours.
Well, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here in Bologna. I've had many students from the MA International Relations program in Leiden who've come here, and I've always been jealous because I've seen, the beauty of this town. It's nice to finally be in here. Maybe some of you are from the MAIR, and I'm seeing you again, although maybe I don't remember your names and faces. Forgive me if that's the case. Hopefully this clicker will work. It does. Click. There we go. Cool. So I'm going to be talking about the notion of Japan as an adaptive state. I'll explain what I mean by that before going into Myanmar's transition to disciplined democracy. If there's time, I'll talk about the Rakhine conflict, but I think I probably was overly ambitious in trying to include this. But if you have questions, I can certainly return to those slides. One thing that I would like to focus on is Japan's foreign policy discourse, because I think you need to understand the way in which Japanese political elites have understood Japan's place in the world and how this has informed Japan's foreign policy generally, but also in the case that I'm looking at specifically with Myanmar. This is the book. Happy to have it off my shoulders. Disciplining Democracies, Human Insecurity in Japan-Myanmar Relations. It's really speaking to a number of areas which I think are important to think about in Japan's foreign policy, the foreign policy of the international relations of the region, as well as developments more broadly in international relations. So let me just sort of list, I think, the four key areas that I'm looking at. I think the first is that, particularly under Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who was Prime Minister, the longest serving Japanese post-war Prime Minister from 2012 to 2020, Abe touted this value-based diplomacy, promoting democracy, human rights. But at the same time, there were critics of Abe arguing that he had disciplined Japan's democracy and facilitated democratic backsliding abroad. So my book is evaluating this debate in light of Japan's relations with Myanmar and thinking about the ramifications of these relations for Prime Minister Kishida's government today, the current Prime Minister. I'm examining the relationship between Japan and Myanmar from the passage of its constitution, Myanmar's constitution, in May 2008. This was immediately after a devastating cyclone, Cyclone Nargis, hit the country. Approximately 130-odd thousand people died as a result of the devastation caused by that cyclone. Nonetheless, the military government at the time passed the constitution in May 2008. I follow the transition of Myanmar's shift to a disciplined democracy. This is the term used by the Myanmar military, up until and just beyond the February 2021 coup d'etat that ended the transition in Myanmar to a disciplined democracy and then inaugurated the ongoing civil war in Myanmar. But it's also a book that places the Japan-Myanmar relationship in historical context, thinking about how the relationship evolved, what Japan's contemporary ambitions are, commitments to Myanmar are. It's important to remember, and I think this would be the third point, that Myanmar and its neighboring countries continue to face a major humanitarian crisis, with nearly 1.3 million refugees and nearly 2 million internally displaced persons, according to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. I'm essentially arguing that the Japanese government and businesses sidelined universal values for profit at the expense of human beings and human security in the case of Myanmar in my book. I'm also looking at the nexus between security and political economy in the changing context of regional dynamics characterized by great power politics, notably with China's rise with the Belt and Road Initiative, and thinking about how that fits in to Japan's relations with Myanmar. But I think the book also speaks to broader questions about the rise of a liberal democracy around the world, as well as the responsibilities of liberal democratic states like Japan, I think it's still the world's third largest economic power, although this is being threatened, it may move to fourth, but still a very important economic and democratic power. What responsibilities does Japan have to uphold the liberal international order? What sort of contribution should Japan be making to the liberal international order? So that's really where this talk starts. But I think those points about the humanitarian crisis, the ongoing civil war, a liberal democracy in Japan, but across the region, around the world more broadly perhaps, the notion of great power competition, cooperation with the rise of China, these are sort of the key elements that my book is engaging with. Ultimately, to say that Japan has not pursued a value-based diplomacy in the case of its relations with Myanmar. The place to really start this conversation for Japan is at the end of the Cold War, I think. There's a lot more that can be said prior to that, but I have to start somewhere, I suppose. And really, starting with critiques about Japanese mercantilist policy and free riding in international affairs, notably Japan's failure to contribute troops to the international coalition against Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, 1990 to 1991, where Japan was chided for providing money to finance the operation, but not troops. But also criticisms of Japan's rapid resumption of official development assistance in the case of, or in the wake of, the 8888 uprising in Myanmar, where Aung San Suu Kyi rose to prominence as a pro-democracy activist, and the Tiananmen Square crackdown. These events, this combination of events, created a crisis for Japan, a diplomatic crisis for Japan. Now, at the time, a prominent academic of Japan, Ken Calder, was writing that to understand Japan's foreign policy making, we really need to think about how it acts as what he called a reactive state. And this is something he reiterated in 2003.
A colleague of ours in Washington.
Is he? I didn't know that Professor Calder had been connected with SAIS. Done excellent work, and really impressed with Ken Calder's work. What's important about his argument is that he's noting that infighting within Japan's political party, its main political party, the Liberal Democratic Party, but also within Japan's bureaucracy, was hobbling decision-making. And this was combined with a weak prime minister. As a result, Japan was reactive. It reacted to foreign pressure, gaiatsu, on the part of the United States primarily, in order to overcome obstacles to policymaking. Not so long after this, we began to see the emergence of a different argument, that of Japan as an adaptive state, adapting to and adjusting to the demands of the post-Cold War liberal international order, a Japan that essentially was going to play its part in the liberal international order. It was no longer going to be a free rider. So in 1993, the Japanese Diet passed a United Nations peacekeeping operations bill, which enabled the participation of Japan's self-defense forces in UN peacekeeping operations, albeit with numerous restrictions on what they could do. Japan's ODA charter was revised in 1992, and this included provisions for human rights and the promotion of democracy. Japanese government subsequently became champions of human security, a key concept within the UN, notably under the figure of Ogata Sadako, who was head of the UNHCR from 1991 to 2000, and then head of the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, from 2003 to 2012. So this is a sort of key moment of change within Japan's foreign policy elite responding to these crises. But it's also coupled with electoral revisions in the mid-1990s and bureaucratic reforms, which were gradually increasing the power of the prime minister, such that bureaucratic infighting, fighting within the Liberal Democratic Party could be transcended. We saw this particularly with Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro, who's Prime Minister from 2001 to 2005. To scoot ahead a bit, under Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, the power of the Prime Minister has increased even further, notably with the establishment of what's known as the Cabinet Bureau of Personal Affairs. And this enabled the Prime Minister to essentially select the top bureaucrats within Japan's bureaucracy, essentially bringing Japan's bureaucracy to heel. But also within the Liberal Democratic Party, factions were in decline. And this again raised the ability of Abe as prime minister to manage his own party. And as a result, Abe passed a series of bills that were designed to increase Japan's contribution to the international order. Notably, a speech that Abe made in Washington on the 22nd of February 2012, arguing that Japan was back, that Japan was ready to become a normal country, scare quotes, that would contribute to the liberal international order through what he called proactive pacifism. Part of this was US pressure, which is that first point. The Armitage and Nye reports, this was, I think, the third Armitage and Nye report, a bipartisan American report that was pressuring Japan to do more. The US governments on both sides have always pressured the Japanese government to do more, to contribute more to the international order. Here was Abe saying that they would. And in many ways, this is what's been championed in the academic literature, that Japan is making major contributions to the liberal international order, that Japan is Asia's liberal leader. Abe overcame domestic resistance to lead on free trade deals, including the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Just as Trump was coming to power in the United States and enacting increasingly protectionist trade policies, complementing his what's known as Abenomics policy and proactive foreign affairs agenda, Abe was promising to place democratization, peace building, human security at the forefront of Japan's foreign policy. This was his value-based diplomacy. So the increasing power of the Prime Minister Abe, the weakening of factions within his own party, the weakening of the opposition in Japan, this was another key aspect. Also the absence of a major international crisis for Japan in 2012, 2013, as Abe comes to power, right? The LDP dodged the bullet of the triple disaster on the 11th of March, 2011, the tsunami, the earthquake, and the nuclear disaster. So in many ways, all of the elements are in place for Japan to play a greater role. And many in the media, many in academia have hailed Japan as Asia's liberal leader. So this is the sort of transformation, finally, of Japan into an adaptive state. This is what essentially my book is critiquing in terms of Japan's relations with Myanmar. And I think you've got to start domestically with the ways in which many of the policies that Abe was enacting were essentially ushering in increasingly authoritarian forms of governance. So in 2014, the Abe administration reinterpreted the constitution and rammed this through the Japanese Diet to the consternation of the Japanese public. Many people took to the streets to protest against this. He passed a state secrecy law, ostensibly for US-Japan alliance reasons, but this hobbled investigative journalism in Japan, and it was combined with his administration's media muzzling, causing Japan to tumble down the world press freedom rankings. Abe's control of the bureaucracy was demonstrated in its increasing willingness to alter or destroy sensitive documents related to scandals that implicated Prime Minister Abe. Further raising these concerns that Japan's democracy was being disciplined. So this is hardly the record for critiques of the Abe administration of Asia's liberal leader. So for me, I would say that this decidedly authoritarian term, as a professor from Sophia University, Professor Nakano Koichi, phrases it, this decidedly authoritarian term is an important one to highlight in the context of these claims of Japan's liberal leadership. But it also overlaps with this period of transformation in Myanmar to a disciplined democracy. So for both Japan and Myanmar, I think this is a crucial period in their relationship. So is Japan moving towards a more normal country, a more proactive country, an adaptive state, or a more authoritarian one under Abe, as critics would argue? Is Japan becoming Asia's liberal leader? Well, here we turn to Myanmar's transition to a disciplined democracy. What was happening in Myanmar at this time? Following its general elections in 2010, the ruling Democratic Party of Japan from 2009 to 2012 is it's not the only time that a party other than the Liberal Democratic Party have ruled Japan, but there's another period, a very short but important period, in which the electoral reform I mentioned and some bureaucratic reform that I mentioned was passed in the mid-1990s. But apart from those 2 points, the Liberal Democratic Party have been in charge. But at this point, in 2010, when Myanmar held its general elections, the Democratic Party of Japan was in charge. And the Abe administration adopted the DPJ's policy of emphasizing Japan's role as a bridge between Myanmar and the liberal international order, that Japan would support Myanmar's democracy through trade, through aid, through investment. They appointed Sasakawa Yohei, who's chairman of the Nippon Foundation. His family has a colorful history, but then so does Abe's. I can talk about that later. But he appointed Sasakawa Yohei a key ally to mediate in Myanmar's long-standing ethnic conflicts as a means of demonstrating Japan's contribution to the liberal international order. So, in a way, Myanmar provides this key example where the Abe administration, the Japanese government more generally, can demonstrate its international liberal credentials. The Japanese government is concerned with material benefits in Myanmar, certainly, and I'll talk about those in a minute, but also about international status. I think that's important too, very important. So the monograph explores how successive Japanese administrations promoted what I term democratization as process, essentially rewarding the Myanmar military for any step that it takes towards democratization. A couple of political prisoners are released, that gets rewarded with aid, rather than democratization as progress, that key democratic milestones are being reached. Free and fair elections. The 2010 elections in Myanmar were not free and fair, and they were boycotted by Aung San Suu Kyi's party. But nonetheless, the Japanese government saw this as essentially something to be rewarded. So there's a different approach that I think the Japanese government takes in its relationship to Myanmar compared with other members of the G7, arguably. The book also criticizes the Japanese government's human rights rhetoric, looking at particular Japanese initiatives, the creation of special economic zones, notably the Thilawa Special Economic Zone just outside of Yangon, also the development of the Dawe Special Economic Zone, as well as linking Myanmar through what's known as the East-West Economic Corridor and the Southern Economic Corridor. I can show you these on a map in a second. How these undermined the human security of local communities. If there are questions about this, I can respond to it a bit later. I'm questioning the ability of the Japanese government to act as an intermediary in the enduring civil wars between Myanmar's military and armed ethnic groups across the region. Myanmar has been embroiled in a series of conflicts between the Myanmar military and armed ethnic groups since at least 1960. It's been decades and decades of these conflicts. But also the failure of the Japanese government to act in the case of the Rohingya humanitarian crisis, or the Rakhine crisis is probably a more neutral way to word it. Most accounts of the relationship between Japan and Myanmar are focusing on the geo-economic and geopolitical interests in the country, not thinking about the significance of Myanmar's democratic transition for Japan's status as Asia's liberal leader. So I'm looking to sort of unmask the contradictions of Japan's pursuit of its national interests against this notion of a value-based diplomacy, and particularly at how it undermined the security of human beings in Myanmar and those who had fled across its borders. The monograph's adopting a sort of area studies approach to understand this relationship, focusing on how areas are defined for whom, who's included, excluded, how historical factors, including British and Japanese imperialism, continue to impact Myanmar's political economy. That's something that I'll say more about, though, on Friday, so I'll leave that to one side. But again, if you've got questions, that's fine. Certainly what's key to Japan's engagement are geoeconomics and geopolitics. The value-based rhetoric is important in terms of establishing Japan's credentials in the liberal international order, and Japan under Abe is largely successful at doing this. At least until, I would say, 2017, when the situation in Rakhine State deteriorates further, and you have approximately 1 million refugees fleeing Rakhine State, Rohingya refugees, fleeing Rakhine State to Bangladesh. And at that point, I think, Japan's approach, Japan's value-based rhetoric is largely seen as hollow. But until that point, it plays this important role, I think, in presenting Japan internationally as a liberal leader. But the key ambitions for Japan are, and they have been since probably the mid-1990s, to build key infrastructure to connect Myanmar's neighboring Mekong states with the Indian Ocean, and to create special economic zones that would make use of Myanmar's cheap labor. The government and businesses work closely with the military-run Myanmar Economic Cooperation, MEC, and the Myanmar Economic Holdings Limited conglomerate throughout Myanmar's transition to a disciplined democracy. This was despite the UN Human Rights Council signaling out the military-run MEC and MEL as funders of genocide and crimes against humanity. This was in 2018, 2019. It's also despite the United States, the European Union, and Canada targeting MEC and MEL with sanctions in the wake of the February 2021 coup. But the Japanese government and businesses, to a large extent, they continued with business as usual. There's also a military relationship between Japan's self-defense forces and the Myanmar government, and in one case, there's in at least one case, there's a Myanmar general that has been accused by UN agencies of perpetrating genocide and crimes against humanity, who was trained by Japan's self-defense forces. So there's also this military relationship that is ongoing, even post the February 2021 coup. Just to point them out, I don't know if I've got the, is this? No, I think not. Just to point it out. Oh, Do I have a pointer?
Yes.
This little red thing here. No. My pointer. This one, huh? Out of batteries. I'll point it out, but you'll probably lose me on the mic. Just so that you know, this is Yangon. So just outside of Yangon. Oh, go back. Didn't know it would do that either. Just outside of Yangon, you've got the Thilawa Special Economic Zone here that Japan built, and all of the infrastructure around it so that it can function. That's to connect to this, which is the east-west corridor that runs across the Mekong states. Perhaps more importantly is the Dawei Special Economic Zone. And in December 2020, the Japanese government signed on to running, essentially, the establishment of the Dawei Special Economic Zone. Before that, it had been, I think, an Italian and a Thai company that had run the development of Dawei with Japan helping, sort of Japan in the background. But in 2020, just before the coup, the Japanese government signed on and went all in on developing Dawei as a special economic zone, so that it could link to Bangkok, and this is the southern economic corridor. This is key because
Economic corridor, the road.
yeah, basically roads and all of the infrastructure that goes with it, right? So the bridges, the tunnels, the problem, Myanmar's the weakest link here. This is a border where you've got continued ethnic armed groups, continued unrest and violence between the Myanmar military and these armed ethnic groups. So very difficult to build this infrastructure, but building it connects Japanese processing centers in and around Bangkok, particularly also in Vietnam, connecting the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. You're avoiding the Malacca Straits, which is a very narrow waterway, which you won't see on this map, but it's at its lowest. I think there are ships fully laden with oil tankers that are going through that are probably about 1.5 meters, 2 meters above the bottom of this waterway. You've seen in the case of the Suez Canal what can happen when a major oil tanker blocks a major waterway like that. You'd have a similar issue, maybe of a higher magnitude, if the Malacca Straits were blocked. So this is a real alternative, and the Japanese government has seen this for well, at least since the mid-1990s. This has been a real ambition for them. Got about 5 minutes left, I think, to witter on, which means that I will skip the discussion of the Rohingya, but I can come back to it later. The key thing about the Rohingya is that primarily it's an identity-based conflict, but it's an identity-based conflict that Japan, the Japanese government, the Japanese ambassador misinterprets as one that can be solved through economic solutions. So as the violence increases in Rakhine State, they host an investment fair in Rakhine State, encouraging Japanese businesses to come and other international businesses to come to Japan, Rakhine State, and invest in Rakhine State, as if this is going to solve the Rohingya situation. There's a full buy-in of a Myanmar-led effort at justice and reconciliation. So they basically say the military, the Myanmar government have a free hand in dealing with all questions related to charges of genocide or crimes against humanity. The Japanese government fully supports Myanmar in that. And externalizing the refugee issue. There are some figures that I've got that I noted down. I can probably dig out very quickly for you, just to give you an idea. We're talking about nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. Around 2016, when the crisis happened and these refugees began flooding into Bangladesh, Japan received 10,901 refugee applications, of which it accepted 29. That's 29 out of 10,901. Italy, I learned in the same year, had 130,411 refugees and migrants entering. Different situation, of course, but the numbers are so starkly different. A different example would be Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Japan accepted 2,256 refugees. It hadn't really done that since the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the last time Japan did anything like this, accepting over 2,000 Ukrainian refugees. Italy, of course, has accepted 167,525 refugees. Just in terms of the order of magnitude, and I can talk about Japan's refugee policy later if you're interested. This is not, yes, I mean, you know, there are all kinds of reasons you can say you're comparing apples and pears, but the order of magnitude in terms of the number of refugees being accepted is so stark. All right, I notice that I am out of time now. Is that all right? Okay, this point here, though, I think is important, because I think we need to sort of set out the manner in which successive Japanese political elites have tried to understand their contribution to the liberal international order, how they framed it, and the kind of contradictions that are within that rhetorical or discursive framing of Japan's contribution to the liberal international order. Very quickly, the first of these is this notion of Japan as a thought leader or as a bridge. So you've got this idea that Japanese foreign policy elites are saying Japan can be a bridge, kakehashi, a neutral intermediary that can connect underdeveloped Myanmar with the global political economy and the international community, that it can translate the rules, the institutions, the norms of the liberal international order to the Asian regional context, that this is Japan's role. This is a theme that's repeated in Japan's foreign policy discourse and kind of is used to symbolize Japan's identity as both an East Asian or an Asian power and a Western power. That Japan is the first Asian country to develop, to democratize, that it can teach its experience to others throughout the region as a thought leader. But this is a problematic notion if you think about it spatially, in the sense that it assumes that Japan can transform others based on Japan's experience, but only Japan has that capacity because of its unique identity, supposedly unique identity, to transform others based on Japan's experience. Only Japan can act as a bridge. Other states that are transformed by Japan to become like Japan can never become Japan. They can never be Japan. Right? They're forever on the other side of this bridge, if you like, requiring Japan's assistance. It also is a notion of Japan as a bridge that's neither one or the other, but perpetually in between, sort of paradoxical spatial position in which both universal and traditional values are promoted simultaneously. There's also this juxtaposition between claims at being inclusive in its foreign policy, inclusive in terms of development, engaging with local communities. But Japan's assistance has actually seldom engaged with these communities. It's largely been state-centered. It's not empowered local communities, it's sidelined them. So this state-centric approach to economic development, also to conflict mediation, including that military relationship with the self-defense forces, is really sidelining local communities in Japan and strengthening the state. The view historically is to strengthen the state and to create economic development. That pathway is the pathway to further economic development, to further political development. There's also this sort of temporal contradiction between Japan as Asia's oldest democracy and developed state, contrasted with a sort of temporal break after World War II. Pre-World War II is never talked about, but Japan's been Asia's oldest democracy since the late 19th century, right? So this notion of Japan as having this sort of temporal continuity, this thought leadership, there's this space that is simply not talked about. After World War II, after this temporal break, this is where Japan becomes a peaceful, advanced, democratic, and developed power. So there's that contradiction temporally in the discourse. And also ethically, there's this emphasis on both Asian and universal values. There's a speech that Abe Shinzo makes where he talks about Asia being the home of universal values. It's largely accepted that Asia is where it's at in terms of democratization, and Asia is the home of universal values because of their Asian flavor. And the speech goes on in this vein to mix universal with Asian values, with an Asian values discourse. So there's this confusion, there's this contradiction within the rhetoric that speaks to how Japanese foreign policy elites over the decades have come to understand Japan's place in the world as. And unless you deal with that underlying rhetoric, unless you sort of, question how Japanese elites have presented this image to the world, you don't get to a place where you can challenge what is essentially an ontological argument that the government of Japan makes. Because we say we promote universal values, we're benevolent. Only by sort of undermining that discourse can you get to a more epistemological argument that would say, because our foreign policy can objectively be seen as promoting human rights, human security, democratization, because of that, that makes us, Asia's liberal leader, or that makes us a value-based diplomat, or whatever it is. So that's something that the book tries to get at as well, that underlying discourse about how Japanese foreign policy elites across the decades have tried to present Japan's role to the world. I think that's a place where I can stop.
Well, I'm going to throw the floor open for discussion, and if there's anybody online, remember to send your questions in the Q&A. That's right, isn't it? In the Q&A format. Yeah. But I'm going to start, while you're thinking, I'm going to start the ball rolling with a question of my own, abusing my position as chair. I was listening to, your talk was very interesting, Lindsay. Are you saying, but let me just ask you one question. Is this so surprising, this element of exceptionalism on the part of Japan? In other words, talking about human rights, talking about democratization, but rarely, making sure you're shoring up the people who will look after economic interests in your geopolitical position. I mean, think of Blair with his so-called ethical foreign policy, which lasted 2 years, or the entire history of the United States as foreign policy could all be equally be argued to be pretty much the same. No?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. What's really surprising about what Japan's doing is any other power doing anything significantly different from Japan in terms of not living up to its human rights rhetoric. It's how it does it differently that I think is interesting, right? And you see it in this distinction between democratization as process versus democratization as progress. It takes, I mean, I showed that picture of Obama meeting Thein Sein in one of the slides, and I kind of skipped over it. That's a very important moment for the United States. Prior to that, Clinton had visited Myanmar, and it was really the stamp of approval for what was happening. It took 3 hard years of diplomacy to get to that point, I think, where the United States really bought into what was happening in Myanmar. The Japanese government was much quicker to do that, right? And that's that distinction between democratization as progress on the part of, I think, other members of the G7 apart from Japan, that would say, we need to really see that these milestones are being met. You know, Aung San Suu Kyi has to be released. Her party has to be able to participate in free and fair elections. We need to see this already with by-elections in the country. You know, these are the kind of things they needed. For Japan, the Japanese government, you know, they didn't condemn the 2010 general elections. They did voice their disappointment that it wasn't as free and fair as it could have been, but it was very clear that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Japanese government at the time, was emphasizing that this is part of a long-term process of democratization. So this is one aspect where you see that difference between how Japan is acting in terms of this value-based diplomacy. And I think also in terms of the rhetoric, you know, this notion of Japan as a bridge, that Japan has certain unique characteristics as Asia's first democratized and developed state, that it can act as this leader between the East and between West, and this is the role that it plays in the international liberal order. So it's not surprising that Japan is not living up to the rhetoric, although arguably, I think the example that you raised with Blair is a very important one, because you know, they deserve all the criticism they get for being so forthright about it. I mean, most countries aren't as forthright as Japan has been, or Blair was for those couple of years. And I mean, the Blair administration took a lot of flack for that, right? And they backed down from that value-based diplomacy. The Japanese government were able to spin it out. They were able to keep it going. I think would arguably still continue that discourse of, you know, value-based diplomacy. They still see themselves playing that role. Blair couldn't get away with that. So I think that's probably the difference between them. That's what I'm.
Yeah, see it. Please. Yeah, gentleman here. Give me your name, please, and anything else you want to say.
Hello. Dr. Black, thank you very much for sharing your research with us. My name is Callahan. I have a question regarding the sanctions levied against Mech and Mel, and how you said for Japan it was business as usual. I want to know about the general public reception of the Japanese public to the continuation of business between Japan and Mech and Mel, and as someone who doesn't really know a lot about political involvement amongst the general public within Japan, is it a controversial topic or not as much? Thank you.
Can I take two questions and a second question, please? And then, okay, please.
Hello, Professor. Yeah, this is on. Thank you very much, Colin. That was terrifically interesting.
Name.
My name is Metro Devoto. I'm in the MAIR program. I'm interested as to, the continuation of Japanese involvement in Myanmar's economy, essentially, and how you might see, so Myanmar is a link in the BRI chain still, and how you might see Japan's preserved involvement as firstly encouraged by the US to counter sort of Chinese BRI dominance over Asia's current sort of development, economic development, and how Japanese, the sort of Japanese preservation of its involvement there might be, in fact, as a way to counterbalance China's BRI. And you mentioned special economic zones. This is something that exists within the BRI, and so Japan is, I don't know about those, but seems to be replicating within Myanmar. And how this is perhaps, Japan going from a reactive state to a proactive state or player on the international stage, how this is sort of maybe in line with the development of a Japanese grand strategy, both within the Indo-Pacific, but globally, in that its sort of involvement or continued involvement in Myanmar, despite obviously sustaining the autocratic or the military junta there, might be a sort of formation of a Japanese, willingness to act in line with their grand strategy that is in line with the US's one, but is also sort of counter to China's grand strategy for Asian regional domination.
Well, I see we have a couple of experts there. Lindsay.
Thank you both for these questions. The two important areas that I didn't really get a chance to touch on. The first one, the response of the Japanese people's civil society. What's been interesting and concerning is considering the scale of the humanitarian crisis, how quickly the issues related to Myanmar have disappeared off the media cycle. It didn't take long at all for this to kind of melt away. If you look at the coup in February 2021, largely by April 2021, certainly by May 2021, it's disappeared off the radar pretty much. So there's that lack of continued media engagement, and this isn't just Japan. This is across the world, I think, well, across the Western world, you might say. So that's a problem in terms of not just the Japanese people's response, but more broadly, that it's failed to capture the media attention. Once it's out of the media spotlight, the interest wanes and largely disappears. Japan does have an active civil society, though, and this is really important to highlight. In fact, the last slide has people demonstrating outside the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kasumigaseki against the coup. This was February 2021, where Japanese civil society groups took to the streets together with people from Myanmar who were living in Japan. Groups like Mekong Watch that's a Japanese-based civil society group, have been very active in highlighting the problems with Japan's engagement with Myanmar, everything from the special economic zones to Japan's attempts at mediation in the Rohingya crisis and so forth. So the civil society is very active, but it's been largely sidelined. What's worrying about Japan at at the moment, after the Abe administration, is the extent to which, the media's ability to question the government has been impacted by certain laws like the state secrecy law. If you are a journalist who gets information that has been designated a state secret, and you as a journalist would never know what that was, then you can spend a lengthy period, 10 years or more in jail as a result of this. Critics look at that and say, well, there's so many similarities with the laws that the Japanese government was passing in the 1930s. So that's an element that I think you have to consider here as well. But there is an active civil society. There are people who do speak out on this for the most part, because it's gone off the media spotlight, because it's out of the media spotlight. They're not getting a hearing. So when I say business as usual, I think the response in Japan at the moment is to kind of wait it out, to see what happens, wait until a moment when particularly the Association of Southeast Asian Nations can recognize the military government under Min Aung Hlaing, and Japan can then follow suit and continue full steam ahead with its engagement with Myanmar, new ODA projects, ramping up the special economic zones, particularly Dawe, and the infrastructure project to link it to the Southern Economic Corridor. These would be what I would say the Japanese government is waiting for. But very important to mention Japanese civil society. I've been criticizing Japan's political elite. Civil society is very important to mention too. Japan countering China within the free and open Indo-Pacific. Yes, definitely. That's a big part of the rhetoric. And one of the things that came out after the February 2021 coup amongst Japan's political elite was this: we can't sanction the Myanmar government, the Myanmar military government that's just undertaken this coup. If we do, then China will win. It's nonsense. And here's why. It doesn't work. If you look at this map, what you've got on this map, as I pointed out, right, was the east-west corridor, the southern corridor. This is where Japan's focus is. It's on linking Japanese production networks in Thailand, particularly in Vietnam, also to an extent in Cambodia and less extent in Laos, through to the Indian Ocean. That's the objective. And that's not where China is focusing in terms of the BSIM corridor. So the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar corridor. The geography's weird in the BSIM, but you get the idea. They're working from, and I'll point it out, from Yunnan. They want to connect Yunnan province to Dokpur, which is here in Rakhine State. That's where they're building their special economic zone. That's their focus in the north. And their focus is here, north-south. Now, if you listen to Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs or Japan's foreign ministers, they would say, it's important that we provide a counterweight in Myanmar. You listen to, or you look at reports from the Japan International Cooperation Agency, JICA, or the Ministry of Economics, Trade and Industry, and they're saying, isn't it great that we'll be able to hook up with China's north-south corridor? That's really going to benefit what we're doing with the east-west corridor and the southern corridor. So there's that foreign policy rhetoric that's all about countering China. But you look at the business elites and they see the opportunities in terms of connectivity throughout the region. This is only going to be mutually beneficial. That competition isn't necessarily there in the way that the foreign policy elites are presenting it, I would say.
Any further questions? Yes, please. Got two questions, first and then second.
Thank you. It was really interesting. Thank you so much. My name is Hannah. I was wondering, so Japan has been moving away a little bit from its Article 9 of its constitution. They have been ramping up the militarization. But the rhetoric of the government is still that all of this is constitutional. And this, I think, as far as I know, there's been some debate about it. I was just wondering if that increasing militarization is also in line with this foreign policy attitude of do as I say, not as I do. If you think that connects to these attitudes. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Marley. This will be another Japan-specific question, but I want to ask, like, on the one side with Japan apportionment system, the weaknesses of the Supreme Court and the basic guarantees that the LDP and its coalitions will win elections, and, you know, within the LDP counts as democratic competition. Your opinion, do you think that we can still call Japan a true democracy or something else?
Professor Frosini approved of that question.
Good questions. Let's start with Article 9. Thanks, Hannah.
I should say you were lucky you weren't asked about the preamble to the Japanese Constitution.
We can get into the preambles. Yeah, is Article 9 constitutional? The debate here really is about, and this kind of goes away from Japan-Myanmar relations. You know, you do have that cooperation between the military and self-defense forces in the case of Japan-Myanmar relations, but there's nothing. You know, this comes out again, and this connects with that last question about China. You know, there's been this notion that, you know, it's not just economic reasons, that there's also strategic reasons that Japan is responding to China here in Myanmar and the creation of security bases. But it's, again, this is all, you know, rhetoric and very, very vague, and there's no real concrete evidence of it. So this is a question that does sort of move away from the talk to a degree. I mean, it does connect with this question. I think the other question as well connects with this issue of disciplining democracy in Japan, right? The constitution, Japan's constitution is very difficult to change. I think it's Article 84 of Japan's constitution that concerns how it can be changed. You need a majority, was it a 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament, which the Liberal Democratic Party now arguably has, combined with a majority in a referendum, which the Japanese government is not sure that it can get, is far from certain that it could get it, particularly with the Russia-Ukraine conflict ongoing. The Abe administration had constitutional revision as its sort of core aim. It really had this. It's not just Abe's dream; it's his grandfather's dream, Kishi. And Kishi was prime minister during the late 1950s, 1960. This is when the UN-Japan Security Treaty was first revised. Kishi's ambition really was to overturn the post-war settlement, just as Abe took that on from his grandfather and said, okay, well, I will take this on board as well. Kishi was convicted or he was indicted as a Class A war criminal, but he was released during the Cold War as part of the reverse course to help Japan re-establish itself and be a bulwark against communist expansionism. Abe realized that he couldn't revise the constitution, it would be too difficult, so he just reinterpreted it. this was interesting in the extent to which the Japanese public responded, particularly students. There was a student movement that took to the streets in 2014, 2015 against these changes that the Abe administration were making. So again, civil society is right there, it's protesting, but it wasn't able to stop the Liberal Democratic Party on this. Reinterpreting the constitution like that at the whim of a government is, yeah. The Supreme Court let it go. But there were members of Japan's legal establishment, including former members of the Supreme Court, who said it was not constitutional. So that debate is one that continues. And then that speaks to the second question, is Japan a true democracy? It's a horrible question to answer, really, isn't it? Because what's a true democracy? My family comes from Scotland, and we didn't vote for Brexit. Any opportunity I get, why not mention that? It's the situation in Japan worries me, and I think it worries a lot of Japanese people at the moment. I mean, you can say that Kishida is not Abe. Kishida's not great either, but he's not Abe. He's not from the far right of the LDP party. He's more centrist. But the kind of changes that occurred under Abe, with the control over the bureaucracy through the cabinet bureau, the personal affairs, the media muzzling and the pressure on Japan's media, the state secrecy law, the reinterpretation of the constitution, these are all moves that concern many Japan watchers, not just me. And arguably, yeah, the shift is towards, we were seeing a shift towards a more liberal form of democracy. After Abe stepped down and Prime Minister Suga took over, one of the first things that Suga did was say, the government will appoint the head of the top academic councils. That won't be something that academics themselves decide. The government will decide that now. So it was that continued in the same vein, and Kishida has also reinforced that. So yeah, worrying times for Japan's democracy, I would say.
I confess I'm learning an awful lot just recently. Any final questions? One, two, any of the colleagues? Yes, please. No, it's your turn.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Lisa Henson. I'm assistant professor, normally based at the DC campus, but here for this term. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I also learned a lot. My first book was on contestation over national identity and foreign policy in Turkey, so I'm really fascinated by and interested in debates over role identities. And I think what's really interesting about your talk today is that you highlighted both the discrepancy between sort of the vaulted, proclaimed, articulated identity or sort of role position in the world, and then what it actually looks like on the ground. And then you also highlighted internal sort of debates. You've got the business elite on one hand, and then you've got the foreign ministry on the other. And then I think there's also something to be said for when external events shape individuals' perceptions of Japan's role in the world and sort of what its foreign policy should be. And you mentioned sort of the shame that was brought upon Japan following the solely financial contribution to the 1990-91 Gulf War. And if I remember correctly, Japan was sort of on the other side of the international community for the 2003 Iraq War. And it seemed as though, and that was like quite a puzzle, right? Like, how do you sort of have Japan not supporting what many of the international community did in the early years and then supporting it more in the later? And so I'm wondering the extent to which you think that these sort of external shocks, or sort of what are the inflection points that can shift individuals' conceptions of foreign policy, and if you've seen any other inflection points similar to that particular event. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. It's a very delicate one because I try not to use the term identity. Yeah, and role conception I think is probably that connects more with or I'd be more comfortable with that term. And that's because, you know, in the literature you see on Japan's foreign policy, there is this focus on I think you call them inflection points, you know, moments where there's a sudden shift and Japan's identity takes off in a different direction. And that's a simplification both of the literature and of the question, which I think is a very important one. But there's a danger, I think, in international relations that in certain strands of constructivist international relations, and I see this in writings on Japan's foreign policy, that say, you know, there's this dominant discourse of Japan is X, and maybe some competing discourses of Japan is Y or Z. And then there comes a moment where this changes and a different foreign policy takes center stage, or a different role conception takes center stage. What I was trying to look at through the book was just how durable or enduring elements of this role conception were across time. If you look for this idea of thought leadership for Japan as a bridge, you'll find it in the 1930s. There are echoes that, you know, in the 1930s. Not that Japanese foreign policy talks about the 1930s World War II. That's, you know, we break that off. That's something we don't talk about. And then you see echoes of it in the Bandung Conference in 1955. It comes back in Bandung. The co-prosperity sphere comes back in 1955. It's mentioned in the context of the Bandung Conference. So, you know, the idea that there's a moment where things change, at least in the foreign policy literature on Japan, often misses that continuity. And I think it needs to be more careful about how it engages with that. So I'm always careful about, you know, the idea that, you know, at that moment, things change, right? I think there's a lot to be said about, okay, yes, checkbook diplomacy and the criticisms of checkbook diplomacy in the 1990-1991 Gulf War, you know, pushing Japan to shift its direction. But how much did it really change? You know, the mercantilism that it was being criticized for in the 1980s, well, that sort of continues today. You know, you see that in Japan's relations with Myanmar. So I think the idea that, you know, everything changed, it misses the important continuities. And that reminds me of something in response to your earlier question, you know, Japan competing with China. You know, Marie Soderberg, who writes about Japan's official development assistance, wrote an interesting book chapter on Japan's official development assistance as soft power, essentially arguing that everything that you see in South Korea's official development policy, everything that you see in China's essentially official development assistance policy, it learned from Japan. What China's doing through the Belt and Road Initiative is not different from what Japan's been doing since the 1960s. Japan has acted in that sense, I guess, as a thought leader, promoting its idea of official development assistance in this case. So again, it's that sort of sense of continuity.
Well, I think we've had a welcome break from SAIS Europe's Eurocentrism, and I think we should thank Professor Black for a very stimulating talk. I, for one, have learned a lot. Thank you.